At first glance, the town looked like hundreds of others scattered across the country. Tree-lined streets, familiar storefronts, a place where people waved at each other without thinking twice. The kind of town where routines mattered and surprises were rare. But beneath that calm surface lived a question that never quite went away. It wasn't spoken loudly. It didn't appear in headlines anymore, yet it lingered in conversations that stopped mid-sentence, in long pauses when certain names were mentioned, in the way older residents looked away when newcomers asked about the past. Years earlier, something had happened here, something that was officially resolved, filed away, and labeled as closed. But closure, it turned out, was not the same as peace. Those who lived through it remembered the confusion, the sudden police presence, the rumors that spread faster than facts, and the strange feeling that followed, the sense that the answer everyone accepted might not be the full story. This was not a town haunted by tragedy alone. It was haunted by uncertainty. The incident itself didn't announce its importance. There were no sirens at first, no dramatic public scene, just a call placed, a response initiated, and a situation that quickly became serious. By the time word spread, police vehicles were already arriving. Neighbors watched from windows and porches, trying to understand what had happened and why. Early reports were inconsistent. Some said it was an accident. Others believed it was intentional. A few insisted there was more to the story than anyone was admitting. Investigators began gathering information, but almost immediately a problem emerged. No single account matched another completely. Timelines overlapped but didn't align. Small details conflicted, and each attempt to clarify only introduced new questions. Still, pressure mounted to make sense of it quickly, because in towns like this, unresolved questions make people uneasy. From the beginning, investigators followed procedure. The scene was secured, evidence documented, interviews witnesses. On paper, everything looked thorough. But investigations don't live on paper alone. They live in judgment calls, what to prioritize, what to revisit later, what seems reliable, and what feels uncertain. Several officers noticed inconsistencies early on, minor contradictions that didn't rise to the level of alarm but refused to disappear. A statement here didn't match physical evidence there. A timeline felt rushed. A key moment depended entirely on one account. None of it was enough to stop the investigation, but it was enough to create doubt. And doubt, in a case demanding resolution, is often inconvenient. As days passed, expectations grew. The public wanted clarity, local leaders wanted reassurance, and investigators felt the weight of responsibility. Eventually, a theory emerged that fit, not perfectly, but sufficiently. It explained most of the evidence, it satisfied procedural requirements, and importantly, it allowed the case to move forward. Some questions were left unanswered, some details were marked for later review, but later never arrived. The case was officially closed. To many, it was over. To a few, it had only just begun. Because deep down, they knew the truth had been simplified, not solved. The case may have been closed, but memories didn't follow official timelines. Years after the investigation ended, people still remembered that day, just not in the same way. When conversations drifted toward the case, stories surfaced quietly, almost reluctantly. One neighbor remembered hearing voices long after the official timeline said the scene was silent. Another recalled seeing a vehicle that never appeared in the report. A shop owner mentioned a conversation that felt strange at the time, but impossible to forget later. None of these accounts were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern. What made these recollections unsettling wasn't their emotion, it was their consistency. Different people, different places, same uneasy feeling. Something didn't line up. The original investigation had relied heavily on a narrow group of statements, Others were recorded, then quietly sidelined, not because they were false, but because they complicated the narrative. And complicated narratives slow cases down. Physical evidence doesn't change, but how it's interpreted can. When investigators revisited the files years later, they noticed details that had once been dismissed as insignificant. A measurement that was rounded instead of exact, a timestamp that didn't align with the reported sequence, an item logged but never fully examined. At the time, these details didn't stop the investigation. Now they raised questions no one could ignore. Why was one object photographed but not tested? Why did the timeline depend on assumptions rather than verification? Why did follow-up notes abruptly end? The evidence wasn't screaming misconduct, it was whispering negligence. And in complex cases, negligence can be just as damaging as intent. Investigations don't exist in a vacuum. Behind every decision are expectations, from superiors, from the public, from the community itself. In this case, pressure arrived early. The town needed answers, local officials needed calm, and investigators needed closure, not just for the case, but for themselves. As weeks passed without a clean resolution, urgency replaced patience. A theory that once felt incomplete began to feel necessary, not because it was perfect, but because it was acceptable. Some officers questioned it quietly. Others convinced themselves the missing pieces would surface later. But later never came, because once a conclusion is announced, revisiting it feels like reopening wounds, and no one wanted to do that. Years passed. New officers joined the department. Others retired, but the case file remained, gathering dust, officially dormant. Until one day, it was pulled from the shelf. Not because of public demand, not because of media pressure, but because someone noticed a contradiction they couldn't ignore. A detail that shouldn't have existed. A discrepancy so small it had been overlooked, yet so critical it threatened the entire conclusion. This wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was worse. It was quiet, undeniable, and documented. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The case that refused a simple answer was about to demand a complicated truth.
Reopening a closed case is never taken lightly. It's not an admission of failure, at least not on paper. Officially, it's called a review. Internally, everyone knows what it means. Something doesn't sit right anymore. The announcement was quiet. No press release, no public statement. Just a memo circulated through the department, listing names assigned to the review. Some officers felt relief. Others felt exposed. Because reopening a case doesn't just re-examine evidence, it re-examines decisions. Old notes were reread, this time without urgency. Timelines were reconstructed without assumptions. Statements were compared side by side instead of summarized. Almost immediately, contradictions surfaced. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. The kind that only appear when you stop rushing toward closure. And once they appeared, they multiplied. The most dangerous phrase in any investigation is, "We already looked at that." This time, the evidence was approached differently. Items once deemed irrelevant were reconsidered. Context was restored to things previously isolated. Technology had changed, but more importantly, perspective had. One investigator noticed something overlooked for years, not what was present, but what was missing. A gap in documentation, a test that was never logged as completed, a follow-up that ended without explanation. None of it proved wrongdoing, but it proved incompleteness. And incomplete investigations leave room for error, sometimes irreversible error. The evidence hadn't changed, the questions had. Every case has a backbone, a central theory holding everything together. In this one, that backbone had always been timing. If the timeline worked, the conclusion stood. If it didn't, everything collapsed. As investigators reconstructed events minute by minute, they realized the timeline depended on assumptions rather than confirmations. One key moment relied on a witness estimate, not a verified timestamp. Another depended on a sequence that only worked if every variable behaved perfectly. Real life rarely does. When alternate timelines were tested, a troubling realization emerged. There were windows of time previously declared impossible. Windows where things could have happened. Windows where someone else could have been involved. That was the moment silence filled the room. Because once a theory cracks, it never fully recovers. Reopening evidence is one thing. Reopening accountability is another. As inconsistencies mounted, attention turned not toward malice, but toward decision-making. Why were certain leads abandoned early? Why were some witnesses deprioritized? Why was speed valued over certainty? These weren't accusations, they were questions. But questions have weight, especially when they arrive years too late. Some former investigators cooperated fully. Others struggled to remember details. A few were defensive, not because they were guilty, but because they were human. Admitting uncertainty after years of confidence isn't easy, yet the review team wasn't looking for blame. They were looking for truth, and the truth was becoming clear, even if it was uncomfortable. Breakthroughs rarely arrive loudly. They slip in quietly, disguised as routine. The details surface during a routine recheck of archived materials. An investigator wasn't even looking for answers anymore, just consistency. Dates, names, signatures. That's when it appeared. A notation, small, easily dismissed, written in the margin of a document no one had prioritized. It referenced an interaction that was never formally documented elsewhere. Not evidence of guilt, not evidence of innocence, evidence of presence. Someone had been there, someone not accounted for in the official narrative. That single note didn't solve the case, but it refused to fit. And once something refuses to fit, it demands attention. Once the detail was acknowledged, it couldn't be unseen. Investigators followed it carefully, aware that chasing false hope can be dangerous. But this wasn't hope, it was responsibility. They traced the reference to a name. The name led to a role. The role led to a location. And suddenly the case expanded beyond its original boundaries. This wasn't about a single mistake, it was about an incomplete picture. Records confirmed that the individual existed. Schedules confirmed proximity, yet nowhere in the original investigation was their involvement meaningfully explored. Why? Not because of a cover-up, because the case had already decided what it was before all the facts arrived. The investigation hadn't failed, it had finished too soon. For the first time since the case reopened, pieces started fitting together naturally, without force. The new timeline worked, witness statements aligned instead of contradicting. Physical evidence supported possibility instead of assumption. Nothing dramatic happened. No confession, no sudden revelation, just clarity. And clarity is powerful. It explained why earlier conclusions felt rushed, why doubts lingered quietly for years, why no one ever felt fully at peace with the outcome. The case didn't need a villain, it needed patience, and finally, it had it. The final stage wasn't about rewriting history, it was about correcting it. Investigators documented their findings carefully, aware of the weight their conclusions carried. Every word mattered, every acknowledgement mattered. The case wasn't undone, it was understood. Recommendations were made, records updated, and for the first time, the story told by the evidence matched the reality it represented. There were no cheers, just relief. Because justice isn't always loud, sometimes it's simply accurate, and accuracy changes everything. Once clarity was achieved, the next step was responsibility. Investigators compiled their findings into a formal report, not a summary, but a reconstruction. Every correction was supported, every conclusion tied back to verified facts. This wasn't about proving someone wrong, it was about making the truth permanent. Supervisors reviewed the work carefully. Legal advisors ensured accuracy. Language was precise, restrained, and factual. When the final approval came, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt necessary, because the case had spent years in uncertainty, and uncertainty deserved an ending rooted in truth, not convenience. The town had lived with unanswered questions for years, so when officials finally spoke, they did so carefully. Without drama, without defensiveness, they explained what had changed, what had been missed, and what had now been understood. Some residents felt relief, others felt frustration that it took so long. Both reactions were valid, but one thing was clear: the truth mattered, even late, because truth doesn't lose value with time, it gains weight.
For those closest to the case, closure didn't arrive instantly. It arrived slowly, through conversations, acknowledgments, and finally, understanding. There were no celebrations, no dramatic moments, just the quiet realization that the questions they carried for years finally had answers that made sense. The truth didn't erase the past, but it allowed people to stop arguing with it, and that alone was powerful. The case that once refused a simple answer finally accepted a complex one. Not perfect, not dramatic, but honest. It became a reminder that justice is not about speed, it's about persistence, that clarity doesn't always come when we want it, but when we're ready to see it. For investigators, it reshaped how cases would be handled going forward. For the town, it closed a chapter long left open. And for the truth itself, it finally stood, steady, supported, and undeniable. That is what victory looks like in real investigations. Not noise, but certainty.